I never thought one mistake could cost me everything, but it did. I had a love most people search a lifetime for, and I threw it away. What happens when the person you love doesn't fight for you but simply walks away? Stay with me. This is a story you won't forget. I had everything. A devoted husband, a comfortable life, a love that should have lasted forever. But in one reckless moment, I let it all slip through my fingers. I told myself it was harmless, just a thrill, just something missing in my marriage. I was wrong. The night Daniel walked in and saw the truth, he didn't scream, he didn't rage, he didn't fight for me, he just left. No parting words, no second chances, just a door closing behind him. And that silence, it was louder than any fury, because when a man walks away without a word, you know you've truly lost him. I told myself I could fix it, that if I searched for him, explained myself, begged, he'd come back. But I was too late. He was already gone. And the worst part, he had known long before he caught me. He let me destroy myself. And then he disappeared. Now I live with the weight of my choices, haunted by the man I loved, the man who refuses to look back. What happens when the greatest punishment isn't anger, but difference? Stay with me. This is the story of how I lost everything. I can still hear the distant hum of his voice as he mumbles something about leaving, but his words don't register. My heart is pounding too loudly, and all I can think about is what I've done, what we've done. The clock above the stove ticks incessantly, mocking me as I try to steady my breathing. Then a sound outside freezes me in place. Tires on gravel. The crunch grows louder as a car pulls into the driveway, and I know it's Daniel, my husband. He's home. I feel a wave of nausea rise up as Ethan moves closer to the back door. "I'll go out the side," he whispers. There's a flicker of something, urgency, maybe panic, in his tone. I nod stiffly, unable to find words. My throat is dry, my mind racing with possibilities. The door clicks shut behind him, and I stand there, frozen in place, staring at the empty space where he stood. My reflection stares back at me from the darkened window above the sink, and for the first time, I don't recognize myself. The front door creaks open. "Mia, you still up?" Daniel's voice breaks the silence, warm and casual, the way it's always been. I swallow hard, forcing a smile onto my face as I step into the hallway. "Yeah, just cleaning up. How was the trip?" He looks at me, his smile reaching his tired eyes. Exhausting, but it's good to be home. He pulls me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me with the familiarity of years spent together, and for a moment, I almost forget what just happened. Almost. Daniel and I met in college. Back then, I was just a small-town girl who'd never been in love, and he was the charming senior who swept me off my feet. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the room, like I was special. I fell fast and hard, and before I knew it, we were married. But as the years passed, that magic started to fade. Daniel's career and finance took off, and while I was proud of him, his success came at a cost. He was always busy, always distracted, and the man who once made me feel like his world now seemed like a stranger in my own home. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase. People change, right? Life gets in the way. But it wasn't just the late nights at the office or the business trips that left me feeling alone. It was the little things. How he'd stopped asking about my day, how he barely noticed when I'd cut my hair or bought a new dress. That's when Ethan entered the picture. Ethan had been Daniel's best friend since childhood. He was the best man at our wedding, the guy who showed up at every birthday party, every holiday dinner. Over the years, he became like family, a constant presence in our lives. But unlike Daniel, Ethan always seemed to notice me. I remember the first time I felt it. It was at a barbecue last summer. Daniel was busy entertaining clients, as always, and I was left to play hostess. Ethan was standing by the grill, a beer in hand, watching me with an amused smile as I struggled to light the coals. "Here," he said, stepping closer. "Let me help." His hand brushed against mine as he took the lighter, and I felt a spark, literally and figuratively. It was the first time in years that I'd felt seen. From that day on, things started to change. Ethan began showing up more often, sometimes even when Daniel wasn't home. He'd help with little things around the house, fixing a leaky faucet or replacing a burnt-out light bulb. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just being helpful, right? But then there were the comments. "You look beautiful today, Mia," he'd say, his eyes lingering just a little too long. Or, "Daniel's a lucky man." I'd laugh it off, telling myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew better. The truth was, I enjoyed the attention. I craved it. After years of feeling invisible in my own marriage, Ethan's words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the monotony of my everyday life. One evening when Daniel was out of town, Ethan stopped by unannounced. He claimed he was just checking on me, but there was something different about the way he looked at me that night, something I couldn't quite put into words. We ended up sitting on the couch, talking for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me about his failed relationships, his dreams, his fears, and I listened, hanging on to every word like it was the most important thing in the world. At some point, our hands brushed, and I didn't pull away. "Mia," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" I looked into his eyes, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. "Yes," I admitted, "all the time." "Would you like me to continue with the first cheating incident? Or should I adjust the tone or direction of the setup before moving forward?" Daniel had barely been gone a few hours when Ethan texted me. "Need any help around the house tonight?" My stomach flipped as I read the message, my fingers hesitating over the keyboard. There was nothing unusual about Ethan offering to help. He'd done it plenty of times before, but tonight felt different. Daniel was away on a business trip, and the house felt too quiet, too empty. "I think I'm good, but thanks," I typed, pausing before hitting send. But I didn't send it. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The truth was, I didn't want to be alone, and if I was being honest with myself, I didn't want Ethan to leave me alone either. "Sure, come by if you want." It didn't take long for him to reply. "Be there in 10. I set my phone down, feeling equal parts nervous and excited. My heart was racing, my hands slightly shaky as I began tidying up the kitchen. I wasn't expecting him to stay long, just a quick visit, maybe a beer or two, but the anticipation of seeing him felt heavier tonight, charged with an energy I didn't fully understand. When the doorbell rang, I practically jumped out of my skin. I smoothed my hair and took a deep breath before opening the door. Ethan stood there, a six-pack in hand and a familiar smirk on his face. He was wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt that hugged his chest in a way that was hard not to notice. "Thought I'd bring the drinks," he said, holding up the beer. "Thanks," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the living room, glancing around as if he'd been here for the first time, even though he knew the space like the back of his hand. I followed him, trying to act casual, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. We sat on the couch, beers in hand, and talked like we always did. He asked about my day, my plans for the weekend, and we laughed about a story he told about their college days. For a little while, it felt normal, comfortable even, but there was an underlying current to the conversation, an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to address. At some point, the conversation lulled, and Ethan leaned back on the couch, his gaze lingering on me a moment too long. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Different how?" I asked, taking a sip of my beer to avoid meeting his eyes. "I don't know, like you're not happy." I froze, the words hitting too close to home. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off with a laugh, but instead, I found myself nodding. "I guess I'm just tired," I admitted. Tired of feeling invisible. Ethan's expression softened, and he reached out to touch my hand. The gesture was small, but it sent a jolt through me. "You're not invisible, Mia," he said, his voice low. "Not to me." My heart skipped a beat, and I looked down at our hands, his fingers brushing against mine. The air between us felt heavy, electric, and I knew I should pull away. I knew this was dangerous, wrong. But I didn't move. "Ethan," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. But before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative at first, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. When I didn't, the kiss deepened, his hand moving to cup my face. I don't know how it happened so quickly, how the space between us disappeared, but suddenly I was kissing him back. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. We broke apart briefly, both of us breathing heavily. "We shouldn't," I murmured, even as my hands betrayed me, clutching at his shirt. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But I can't stop." Neither could I. He kissed me again, more urgently this time, and I let myself get lost in it. The heat, the thrill, the way his hands moved over my body like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to stop, but my body refused to listen. We didn't make it far, just to the couch, where we tumbled together in a tangle of limbs and whispered breaths. His lips found my neck, my collarbone, and I gasped, my fingers tangling in his hair. For a brief moment, the thought of Daniel flashed through my mind, a sharp pang of guilt slicing through the haze. But Ethan's hands on my skin drowned out the voice of reason, and I let myself fall deeper, surrendering to the moment. Time seemed to blur, and when it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the room silent except for the sound of our breathing. Reality came crashing down around me as I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. "What have we done?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. Ethan didn't answer right away. He sat up, running a hand through his hair and avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I don't regret it." His words should have been comforting, but they weren't. If anything, they made the guilt worse. "I think you should go," I said quietly, sitting up and pulling the blanket over myself. "Yeah, please, Ethan." He hesitated as if he wanted to say something else, but finally nodded. He grabbed his shirt from the floor and pulled it on, pausing at the door to look back at me one last time. "I meant what I said," he said softly. "You're not invisible." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of what we'd done. I sat there for a long time after he left, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. I felt 1,000 different emotions at once: guilt, shame, exhilaration, regret. I didn't know how to process any of it. Didn't know how I was supposed to face Daniel when he came home. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after my first night with Ethan, I woke up to a sinking feeling in my stomach, the weight of guilt pressed against my chest, suffocating and relentless. My skin still tingled where his hands had touched me, but I tried to push the memory away. I told myself it was a mistake, that it could never happen again. But I was lying to myself. The next few days were torturous. I went through the motions of my life as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I could barely look at Daniel without feeling like a fraud. He was so trusting, so oblivious. When he came home from his business trip, he kissed me on the cheek and told me how much he missed me. I forced a smile, nodding, pretending like I hadn't spent a night wrapped in the arms of his best friend. I should have ended it there. I should have cut Ethan off completely, but the problem was, now that I had tasted the forbidden, I couldn't get it out of my system. And neither could he. It started with a text. "Can we talk?" I hesitated before replying. "There's nothing to talk about, Ethan." But I wasn't fooling either of us. "Please, Mia, just one more time. We need to figure this out." A part of me wanted to delete the message and pretend it never happened, but the other part, the part that craved him, needed to see him again. So I made the excuse that I was going grocery shopping and instead met him at a small cafe on the other side of town where no one would recognize us. The moment I saw him, my stomach flipped. He looked good, too good, the kind of good that made it impossible to ignore the pull between us. I slid into the seat across from him, my arms crossed, my resolve shaky at best. "This can't happen again," I said before he could speak. Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "You don't mean that." I swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "It was a mistake." "And why did you come?" I had no answer. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. My breath hitched, and I pulled away, but not before I felt the familiar electricity between us. "Tell me you don't want me, and I'll walk away," he said, his voice soft but firm. I opened my mouth to say the words, to tell him to leave me alone, to tell him I was committed to my husband. But the truth was, I did want him. I wanted him more than I had ever wanted anything. So instead of telling him to leave, I let him take my hand. And that was how it started. A pattern, a secret, a betrayal that grew deeper with every stolen moment. The second time we were together was at his apartment. It wasn't planned, or at least that's what I told myself. Daniel had left town again for a last-minute work retreat, and I was supposed to spend the weekend catching up on things around the house. Instead, I found myself in my car, driving toward Ethan's place like a woman possessed. I told myself it was just to talk, to get closure, but closure never happened between us. The moment he opened the door, I knew there was no turning back. We barely made it past the threshold before his hands were on me, pulling me into him like he'd been starving for days. Maybe he had. Maybe I had too. This time, there was no hesitation, no moment of guilt before giving in. This time, I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. We barely made it to his bed, our bodies tangled in desperation. Everything about him felt different than Daniel, rougher, more urgent. He touched me like he was afraid I might disappear, like I was something he needed to claim. And I let him. I let him erase every trace of my husband from my mind, if only for a little while. Afterward, as I lay there catching my breath, Ethan traced lazy circles on my bare shoulder. "You should stay the night," he murmured. I shook my head, already feeling the weight of reality creeping back in. "I can't." He sighed, rolling onto his back. "You always leave." I turned to face him. "I have to." We both knew why. Daniel. But even as I left his apartment, I knew I'd be back. I told myself each time would be the last, but that was a lie. Because once you cross that line, once you taste something that was never meant to be yours, it's impossible to stop. The weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments, a brush of hands in passing, secret rendezvous at cheap hotels, late-night whispers over the phone while Daniel slept in the next room. Each time it got riskier, more reckless, but neither of us could stop. One evening we nearly got caught. Daniel had planned to go to the gym after work, which meant I had an hour alone. Ethan had shown up, like he always did when the coast was clear. We were in the kitchen kissing against the counter when the sound of the garage door opening shattered the moment. We barely had time to react. Ethan bolted toward the back door just as Daniel walked in, setting his gym bag down by the door. My heart pounded as I forced a smile. "You're home early?" "Yeah," Daniel said, stretching. "Decided to skip today?" I held my breath, waiting for him to notice something was off. The way I was flushed, the way the back door was slightly ajar, the way I was gripping the counter like I might collapse. But he didn't. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly and went to the fridge, completely unaware that his best friend had just been there. It should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't. It only made me more reckless. The first time I thought Daniel might suspect something was when he made a comment at dinner one night. We were sitting across from each other, eating takeout after a long day. The TV played softly in the background, casting a glow over the dimly lit room. Daniel set his fork down, his expression unreadable. "Ethan's been around a lot lately." I felt the air shift. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "Has he?" Daniel nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Yeah, I know we're all close, but I don't know, he's been acting different." I swallowed, my heart pounding. "Different how?" Daniel shrugged. "Just like he's hiding something." A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I forced a laugh. Maybe he's just going through something. Daniel nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. I knew then that the walls were starting to close in. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The beginning of the end came on a night that should have been like any other. Daniel was out of town again. Another work trip, another excuse for me to pretend that my life was as normal as it had always been. The truth was, my life was anything but normal now. Every time Daniel packed his bags, a thrill ran through me, a mix of excitement and dread. Excitement because I knew Ethan would be coming over, dread because deep down, I knew this couldn't last forever. Late. That night, Ethan arrived late, just as he always did. The moment I opened the door, he pulled me into him, his lips crashing against mine in a way that left no room for hesitation. His hands roamed my body like he was trying to memorize every inch of me, and I melted into him, letting myself forget everything except the way he made me feel. And we barely made it to the couch before our clothes started coming off, the heat between us overpowering. It was desperate, messy, wrong, but it was also intoxicating. I had stopped trying to fight it weeks ago, but this time we didn't hear the car pull into the driveway. We didn't hear the sound of the key turning in the lock. We didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The door swung open and there stood Daniel. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Time stopped. Ethan was half on top of me, shirtless, his body covering mine. I was tangled beneath him, my shirt pulled halfway over my head, my jeans undone. There was no hiding it, no pretending. The look on Daniel's face was unlike anything I had ever seen before. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even shocked. He just looked destroyed. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, deep and impossible to cross. My entire body turned to ice as I pushed Ethan off me, scrambling to pull my shirt back down. "Daniel," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't move. He didn't say a word, he just stood there, staring at me as if he no longer recognized me. Ethan, to his credit, at least had the decency to look ashamed. He stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair, avoiding Daniel's gaze. Daniel raised a hand, cutting him off. "Don't." One word, cold, final, and then he looked at me. I had never felt so small in my entire life. How long? His voice was steady, eerily calm. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. How long, yeah? Tears burned my eyes. There you go. Cha dahutka. Al karaten. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, as if debating whether he should answer for me. But Daniel wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking through me. I swallowed hard, knowing that whatever I said next would change everything forever. 3 months, I whispered. Daniel let out a slow breath, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, something inside him had changed. He looked done. I should have known, he muttered, shaking his head. I should have known. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. I mean, Jesus, Ethan, my best friend? Ethan didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. Daniel stepped back toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. I can't do this right now. My stomach dropped. Daniel, please. But he was already walking out. The door slammed shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Ethan left shortly after. He tried to talk to me, tried to tell me that everything would be okay, but I didn't want to hear it. Because nothing was okay. For the first time since this all started, I truly understood what I had done. I had destroyed my marriage. I had broken a man who had never done anything to deserve it. And for what? A few months of excitement? A thrill? I sat in the middle of the living room floor, my hands gripping my hair, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the silent house. I had ruined everything. The next morning, Daniel didn't come home. He didn't call. He didn't text. I spent the entire day waiting, checking my phone every few minutes, hoping, praying that he would say something. But there was nothing. By the time the sun set, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and drove to his office, only to be told by the receptionist that he had taken an indefinite leave of absence. Panic set in. I called him, straight to voicemail. I drove past his usual spots, the bar he liked, the gym, but he was nowhere to be found. He was gone, and I had no one to blame but myself. 2 days later, I received a text from an unknown number. You don't need to look for me. I'll send someone for my things. Don't be here when they come. My throat tightened as I read the words over and over again, my vision blurring with tears. That was it. No anger, no confrontation. Just nothing. It was worse than if he had screamed at me. Worse than if he had thrown things, cursed my name. Because this was indifference. And indifference meant I had already lost him. A week passed, then 2. Daniel never came home. I stopped hearing from Ethan too. Not that it mattered. None of it mattered anymore. I had thought I could control this, that I could have my cake and eat it too, that I could have Ethan and still keep my marriage intact. But life didn't work that way. You can't play with fire and not get burned. And I had burned everything to the ground. The last time I saw Daniel was 3 months later in a lawyer's office. He didn't look at me as he signed the divorce papers. He didn't say a word. And when it was over, he stood, nodded politely, and walked out of my life forever. I wanted to chase after him, to beg him to stay, but I knew better. Some things can't be undone. Some mistakes can't be forgiven. And some love stories don't get a happy ending. The emptiness of the house became unbearable after Daniel left. Every room was a reminder of what I had destroyed. The half-empty dresser where his clothes used to be, the untouched coffee mug in the kitchen, the absence of his scent lingering in the air. For the first time in weeks, I didn't know what to do with myself. I wandered the house like a ghost, waiting for a call that wouldn't come, hoping for a second chance that I didn't deserve. But it was Ethan who showed up first. I heard the knock at the door late one evening, long after I had stopped hoping that Daniel would return. My heart leapt, foolishly thinking, maybe it's him. But when I pulled the door open, it was Ethan standing there instead. I frowned. "What are you doing here?" He looked exhausted, as if the past few weeks had aged him years. "I needed to see you." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Why?" Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Because I hate how we left things. Because I can't stop thinking about you. Because—" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "Because I still want you." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You still don't get it, do you?" His brows furrowed. "Mia, this wasn't a love story, Ethan." My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. It was a mistake, one that cost me everything. Ethan flinched, as if I had physically struck him. "You don't mean that." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "I do." For the first time since this all started, I saw it, the realization settling into his face, the understanding that whatever fantasy he had built in his head, whatever twisted idea he had about us being together, wasn't real. There was no us. There never had been. He took a step back, nodding slowly. "I guess I thought—" He trailed off, looking away. I don't know what I thought. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Neither did I. A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then Ethan sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I should go." I nodded. "Yeah." And just like that, he was gone. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The day Daniel's things were packed and moved out, I didn't watch. I stayed upstairs, sitting on the bed that still smelled like him, listening to the quiet shuffling of boxes, the murmurs of the movers as they carried away pieces of the life we had built together. When it was finally over, I went downstairs, expecting to find the house empty. But Daniel was there, standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the spot where our wedding photo used to hang. I froze. "I thought you'd already left." He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. I wanted to see it one last time. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the railing. "Daniel, Don't." His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't apologize." I blinked, stunned. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't change anything." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've spent weeks trying to understand how we got here, how I didn't see it coming." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. And the truth is, I did see it coming. I just ignored it. Tears burned my eyes. "I never meant to." "But you did." His voice was steady, but there was no anger in it anymore, just sadness. "You did, Mia." I looked away, biting my lip, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm not going to pretend I understand why you did it. I'm not going to tell you that I forgive you, because I don't know if I ever will." A tear slipped down my cheek, but I said nothing. "But I do know this," he continued. "I loved you. I really loved you." His voice cracked slightly, and it shattered something inside me. And maybe that's the hardest part of all. Silence filled the room. I wanted to tell him I still loved him, that I had never stopped, that I wished I could take it all back. But I knew it wouldn't matter. So instead I whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel gave a small, sad smile. "I know." He reached for the door, pausing just before stepping outside. And then, without turning around, he said the words that broke me completely. "Goodbye, Mia." The door clicked shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. For good. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands, sobbing into the emptiness of the house I had destroyed. Because this was it. This was the price of my choices. And for the first time, I had to live with them. So wound. The days after Daniel's departure felt like living in a ghost town. The house was hollow without him, stripped of the warmth that once made it home. His scent had faded from the sheets, his laughter no longer filled the empty spaces. I thought the worst part would be losing him, but I was wrong. The worst part was knowing I had been the one to destroy us. I quit my job a few weeks later. I couldn't bear the whispers from my coworkers, the stolen glances that told me they knew. Small towns had a way of making secrets public, and though Daniel never aired our dirty laundry, the silence spoke volumes. Ethan stopped reaching out. I never tried to find him, because despite everything, I had finally realized what we were. A mistake, a temporary thrill, nothing more. I spent months in that house, drowning in my own guilt, waiting for the pain to dull. But no matter how much time passed, one question haunted me. Where was Daniel? I had expected anger. I had expected screaming, maybe even revenge. But instead, he had disappeared from my life as if I never existed. And that was what terrified me the most. One evening, after months of silence, I found myself driving past our old favorite places that once meant something. The small cafe where we used to have Sunday breakfast, the bookstore where we'd gotten lost in each other between the aisles, and finally, Daniel's old office. It was empty. The lights were off, the windows covered. A for lease sign was taped to the glass. Panic crept up my spine. I had assumed he was staying with a friend or living in a hotel, but what if I had been wrong? What if he had left town entirely? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Daniel had vanished. The search. I spent the next few days searching for him. Calls to his family went straight to voicemail. His parents, who had always been kind to me, suddenly had nothing to say. His best friends, the same ones who used to joke with me at dinner parties, offered nothing but cold indifference. It was as if Daniel had been erased from existence. It didn't make sense. One night, I found myself outside of Ethan's apartment, my heart pounding as I knocked on his door. He opened it, looking like he hadn't slept in days. There were dark circles under his eyes, his usually neat appearance replaced by disheveled exhaustion. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "What are you doing here?" I hesitated. "I need to talk to you." He stepped aside, letting me in. The place was a mess. Half-packed boxes, unopened mail, dishes in the sink. "Are you leaving?" I asked, looking around. He let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, and not much reason to stay anymore, is there?" I turned to him, searching his face. "Ethan, have you seen Daniel?" Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone before I could place it. "No," he said too quickly. "Not since that night." I narrowed my eyes. "Are you sure?" He sighed, walking toward the window and staring outside. "Why are you looking for him, Mia? You think finding him will fix things?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know. I need to talk to him." Ethan shook his head, exhaling slowly. "You're not going to find him." My stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "Daniel, he's not who you think he is." The air in the room shifted. A cold, creeping sensation ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked carefully. Ethan turned to face me, his eyes dark. I think he knew about us long before he caught us." My breath hitched. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." Ethan gave a humorless chuckle. "Think about it, Mia. He's too calm, too prepared. He didn't fight, he didn't even yell, he just left." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That doesn't mean anything. He was hurt. He was planning this," Ethan interrupted. "For a long time." I felt my legs wobble beneath me, the weight of his words hitting me all at once. Had Daniel known? Had he been playing me this entire time? The letter. I returned home that night feeling like my entire world had been turned upside down. I searched through the house looking for anything that might give me answers. And then I found it. A single envelope tucked inside the drawer of Daniel's nightstand. My name was scrawled on the front in his familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Mia, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not just from this house, but from your life. You probably think you understand what happened, but you don't. You think you made a mistake, but the truth is, you were exactly who I thought you were all along. I knew. I knew about you and Ethan long before that night. I knew the moment you changed, the moment your laughter no longer belonged to me, the moment your touch felt like a lie. But I waited. I watched. And then I let you destroy yourself. Did you think you were the only one with secrets? You were wrong. I left you because I wanted to, I disappeared because I could, and I took everything with me. The house, it's not yours anymore. The bank accounts, already emptied. The business, sold. You took away my heart, so I took away your life. Fair trade, don't you think? Don't try to find me. You won't. Enjoy your new life, Mia. You built it yourself. The letter slipped from my fingers. My vision blurred. My stomach twisted. And for the first time in months, I finally understood. I hadn't left Daniel. He had left me, and he had taken everything with him. Finale. I sat in the empty house, my body numb, my mind reeling. Daniel had been playing the long game all along. I had thought I was the one with the power, the one making choices. But he had been waiting, watching, planning, and in the end he had won. I had lost everything, and there was nothing I could do about it. As I sat there, staring at the letter that had shattered my world, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I was truly, utterly alone. And that was the real punishment. Not the loss of the house, not the money, not even the affair. The real punishment was knowing that Daniel had walked away, leaving me behind in the ruins of my own making. And he wasn't coming back, ever. The house was cold, not just because Daniel had stripped it of his presence, but because something inside me had turned to ice. The walls felt too high, the silence too deep, the space too vast. It was no longer a home, it was a tomb, a graveyard for the love I had taken for granted. I spent days moving through it like a ghost, haunting my own mistakes, reliving them over and over. The couch where Ethan and I had tangled ourselves in passion felt like a crime scene. The kitchen table, where Daniel once told me about his dreams, now felt like a witness to my betrayal. I had been selfish. I had been reckless. And in the end, I had not only lost Daniel, I had lost myself. But my mind was a traitor, because even in the depths of my despair, it still reached for something beyond my grasp. It still craved more. And when I closed my eyes at night, I did not dream of regret. I dreamed of fantasy, the fantasy. In my dreams, Daniel never left. In my dreams, he didn't walk away from me that night. Instead, I see him standing in the doorway, his breathing heavy, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He doesn't look away. He doesn't retreat. He owns the moment. Ethan tries to speak, but Daniel silences him with a look so sharp it could cut through steel. Then his eyes flip to me and I feel something coil tight in my stomach. Get up, he orders, his voice low, dark. I don't move. I can't. His steps are slow, deliberate as he crosses the room. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't scream. He doesn't need to. The power radiates off him in waves. I don't know if it's fury or something else, something deeper, something darker. Something that doesn't want to punish me by leaving, but by keeping me. He stops in front of me, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to decide what to do with me. I swallow hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. Daniel. His fingers grip my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His touch is firm, demanding. Do you think you can break me? He murmurs. Do you think I would let you? I shudder beneath his gaze. He turns to Ethan then, his voice clipped, final. Leave. Ethan hesitates. Daniel takes a step closer, and Ethan knows. This isn't his fight. This was never his to have. He leaves. The door slams shut, and then it's just us. Daniel and me, husband and wife, betrayer and betrayed. He steps closer, invading my space, his presence wrapping around me like a vice. You thought I'd walk away? He asks, his voice deceptively soft. I can't speak. You thought I'd let you go? That I'd let another man take what's mine? His fingers trail down my arm, slow, possessive. My breath catches. I should be afraid, but I'm not, because the truth is, this is what I wanted all along. Not his absence, not his forgiveness, his dominance. I wanted to see what was beneath his quiet love, and now I had awakened it. His hand slides around my throat, not squeezing, just holding, claiming. His thumb brushes against my pulse, feeling the rapid beat beneath my skin. You belong to me, he says, his voice dark with promise. And you're going to spend the rest of your life proving it. His lips crash against mine, and I surrender. Not to regret, not to shame, but to the man who refused to be broken by me. The man who owned me. The reality. But that's just a dream. Because in reality, Daniel left. In reality, he didn't fight for me. In reality, he didn't claim me. He walked away, taking everything with him, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of what could have been. I wake up with a start, my body aching with the remnants of a dream that felt too real. My skin is damp, my breath uneven, the sheets beneath me are cold, untouched by the man I wish were still beside me. I press my hand against my chest, as if I can calm the storm inside me, as if I can will the fantasy into existence. But no matter how hard I try, I cannot rewrite the past. Daniel is gone, and I am alone. But the dreams will always remain, because sometimes regret is not enough. Sometimes we crave punishment, and sometimes the greatest punishment of all is knowing the man you betrayed never came back to claim you. Final reflection. People say time heals all wounds. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that time is cruel. It forces you to sit with your mistakes. It strips away the illusions you once hid behind, leaving you raw, exposed. In time, I stopped searching for Daniel, not because I stopped wanting him, but because I knew he had made his choice, and I had to live with mine. There is no happy ending to this story. There is no redemption. There is only the knowledge that I had a love so deep, so powerful, and I threw it away. I wonder if Daniel ever dreams of me. I wonder if he ever wakes up, fists clenched, haunted by the thought of what we could have been. I wonder if there's a version of our story, somewhere in another life, where he stayed, where he fought, where I was worth saving. But I'll never know, because this is my reality. And in this reality, the villain never gets a second chance. The end. This final 2,000 words adds an intense reflection, blending Mia's regret with a fantasy where Daniel didn't leave, where he stayed and claimed her instead, but in reality, she is left with nothing but longing and consequences. Time is cruel. That's the thing they don't tell you about regret. It doesn't fade. It festers. It digs into your bones, embeds itself into your mind, whispers to you at night when you think you're finally at peace. Months had passed since Daniel left. Life moved on around me, but I stayed frozen in place, trapped in the wreckage of my own making. I tried to convince myself that I was healing, that I was stronger now, that I didn't need him. But the truth was, I was waiting for a sign, waiting for a moment where I could wake up and feel normal again, waiting for him to come back. Because deep down, I wanted to believe that love, even fractured, even shattered, could find its way home. The illusion of moving on. I forced myself to go through the motions. I went out with friends, though their company felt hollow. I met men, new faces, new possibilities, but they were all ghosts compared to Daniel. And then, one evening, I found myself in bed with someone else. A stranger. He was handsome in an effortless way, with a smile that hinted at mischief, hands that were eager, a touch that was warm. But when he kissed me, I felt nothing. I let him undress me, let him run his hands over my skin, let him whisper things in my ear that should have made me feel desired. But when I closed my eyes, it was Daniel I saw. Daniel's hands gripping my waist, Daniel's lips ghosting over my skin, Daniel's voice, deep and steady, telling me I was his. I turned my head, breaking the kiss. My breath was shallow, my body tense. "What's wrong?" the man asked, his hand still resting on my hip. I swallowed hard. "I can't do this." His brow furrowed, but he didn't push. "Did I do something?" "No," I cut in, shaking my head. "It's not you. It was never them. It was always him." I left before the night could go any further, barely mumbling an apology as I grabbed my coat and disappeared into the cold. I told myself it was for the best, that I wasn't ready. But the truth was much darker. The truth was, I didn't want to be ready. Because once I let someone else replace him, it would mean he was truly gone. The haunting. The dream started shortly after. At first they were fragmented memories, pieces of the life I had lost. Daniel's voice whispering my name in the dark, his hands pressing into my skin, the way he looked at me across the dinner table like I was the only woman in the world. But then the dreams changed. They became something else, something darker. I was back in our house, the one he had taken from me. The lights were dim, the air thick with tension. I walked through the hallways, feeling his presence everywhere. And then I saw him. He was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching me with those piercing eyes. But he wasn't alone. There was another woman. She was draped across his lap, her fingers tracing slow circles over his chest, her lips brushing against his ear. He smirked at something she said, his attention never wavering from her. And then, as if sensing me, he looked up, straight at me. His expression was unreadable, but his message was clear. "You're watching me now, just like I once watched you." I tried to move, to speak, to beg for forgiveness. But I couldn't. I could only watch as he leaned in, claiming her lips with the same passion he once reserved for me. A silent punishment, a reminder that I had been replaced. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The bed was cold. I pressed my hand against my lips as if trying to erase the image burned into my mind. But it was too late. The dream had done its job. Daniel wasn't coming back, and even if he did, I wouldn't be the woman he came back for. The last encounter, I told myself I wouldn't look for him, that I had to move forward, let him live his life. But addiction doesn't fade so easily, and Daniel had always been my greatest addiction. So one evening, under the influence of too many glasses of wine and a desperation I couldn't suppress, I found myself in front of his new apartment. I didn't even know how I got there. One moment I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The next, I was standing outside his building, my fingers hovering over the keypad. I knew the code, of course I did. For a second I considered turning around, but then the door opened and Daniel stepped out. He froze the moment he saw me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he let out a breath, his voice calm but distant. Yeah. Hearing my name on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Daniel studied me for a moment before shaking his head. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." He exhaled, glancing down the hallway before stepping outside, closing the door behind him. "Are you alone?" I asked, hating the way my voice wavered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "What do you want, Mia?" I bit my lip, my pulse hammering. "You, always you." But I couldn't say it. Not now, not after everything. Instead, I whispered, "I miss you." Daniel's jaw clenched. He looked away for a moment, as if weighing his words. When he finally met my gaze again, there was no anger, no hatred. Just resolve. "You miss the idea of me," he said quietly, "but not the man I am now." A lump formed in my throat. "What does that mean?" "It means I've changed," he said simply, "and so have you." I took a step closer. "That doesn't mean—" "It means," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "that we can't go back." The words crushed me, because deep down, I had always known. Daniel wasn't mine anymore. I had let him slip through my fingers, and now he belonged to a future I wasn't part of. Tears burned my eyes, but I forced a smile. "I guess I just needed to see you one last time." He gave a small nod. "And now you have." A silence stretched between us. And then, before I could lose my nerve, I leaned up and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his cheek. His eyes closed for a brief moment as if savoring it. When I pulled back, I whispered, "Goodbye, Daniel." He didn't stop me. He didn't call my name. He just stood there, watching, as I walked away for the last time. And this time, I didn't look back. The walk back to my car felt heavier than any walk I had ever taken before. Each step away from Daniel was a step away from everything I had once been. The woman I was before the affair, before the betrayals, before the lies, I had buried her the night I let Ethan touch me. And now, standing in the cold, staring at the dimly lit streets, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. Daniel never destroyed me. I destroyed myself. For months, I had told myself that Daniel's indifference was my punishment, that his silence was his way of making me suffer, that his leaving had been his revenge. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, Daniel didn't leave me out of anger. He left me because I had already left him, long before he caught me. Long before the affair even started. I had checked out of our marriage the moment I stopped seeing him as enough, the moment I started craving something more. And when Ethan had given me attention, when he had made me feel seen, I had jumped at it, not because Daniel had failed me, but because I had been too selfish to appreciate what I already had. I had been so busy mourning what I had lost that I never stopped to realize I had never deserved Daniel in the first place. Owning the truth. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove. For hours. The city blurred past me, neon lights flickering in the dark, strangers moving through their own lives, completely unaware that mine had just unraveled. I pulled into an empty parking lot and killed the engine. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating in a way I had never felt before. And for the first time since Daniel left, I let it happen. I let the weight of my choices crash over me. I let myself feel every ounce of guilt, every regret, every single consequence I had spent months trying to avoid. I had told myself that if Daniel had fought for me, I would have fought too. That if he had screamed, cursed my name, begged me to stay, I would have chosen him. But that was a lie, because Daniel had fought for me for years. He had given me his patience, his kindness, his love. He had stayed when I had already emotionally left. And when he had finally walked away, it wasn't out of anger. It was because he had finally realized what I should have seen all along. I was not worth saving. The thought shattered something inside me, because the truth was, I wanted him to hate me. I wanted him to scream at me. I wanted him to make me feel like I was worth his anger, his pain, his rage. But instead, he had just let me go. And that was the cruelest punishment of all, rewriting the story. I had spent months rewriting the past, telling myself that things could have been different, that I had made a mistake, that maybe, just maybe, I could fix it. But standing here now, staring at my reflection in the car window, I realized something else. I never wanted to fix it. I wanted to be the victim. I wanted to tell myself that I had been lonely, that Daniel had neglected me, that Ethan had tempted me. But none of that was true. I wasn't the victim. I was the villain. I had been cruel to a man who had given me everything. I had used another man as an excuse to escape my own boredom. And in the end, I had ruined everything because I had been too selfish to be grateful. There was no way to fix that, no way to rewrite the past. All I could do now was own it, accept it, and live with it. Final goodbye. I didn't reach out to Daniel again, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that letting him move on was the only decent thing I had left to give him. I had already taken too much. I had taken his trust, his love, his sense of security. The least I could do now was let him be happy without me. And Ethan? I never saw him again either. He was just another casualty of my recklessness. Maybe he moved on, maybe he didn't, but he had never really mattered. Not the way Daniel had, not the way I thought he had. In the end, I had destroyed the one person who had truly loved me. And the worst part? I had done it for nothing, for a thrill, for a moment of excitement, for a man I didn't even love. The final realization. I wasn't heartbroken, not in the way I thought I was, because heartbreak happens when you lose something. And the truth was, I hadn't lost Daniel. I had thrown him away. And in the end, I had only broken myself. Because love, real love, doesn't need excitement. It doesn't need drama. It doesn't need stolen moments in the dark. It just is. But I had been too blind to see that. And now I would never have it again. I would spend the rest of my life watching people love each other, knowing that I had once held something rare. And I had let it slip through my fingers. Daniel would move on. He would find someone else, someone who saw him for the man he was, someone who deserved him. And me? I would have to live with the truth that some mistakes can never be undone, that some loves can never be reclaimed, and that sometimes the real punishment is not losing the person you love, but realizing that you were never worthy of them in the first place. The seasons changed, but I remained the same. The leaves outside turned golden, then brittle, then disappeared entirely, much like the life I had once known. Time kept moving forward, dragging me along, though I felt like I had been left behind in the ruins of my choices. I told myself that I would let go of Daniel, that one day I would wake up and the weight of him would no longer linger in my chest. But the truth is, some ghosts never leave you. They live in the spaces between breaths, in the way you hesitate before saying someone else's name, in the moments of silence when you wonder, what if? I never reached out again. I thought about it. I came close. I even drafted a message once. But I knew that silence was the only dignity I had left to give him. He had made his choice, and for once, I respected it. I stopped looking for glimpses of him in crowded places. I stopped scrolling through old photos, rereading texts, torturing myself with memories of a man who had already let me go. And yet he was everywhere. He was in the smell of fresh coffee on a quiet morning. He was in the way certain songs made my heart ache. He was in the shape of my own regret, carved so deeply into me that no amount of time could erase it. I thought I had been searching for him, but all along I had been searching for the woman I used to be, and she was gone. So I left. I packed what little was left of my life and moved away from the city, away from the memories, away from the version of myself that had wrecked everything. I started over, not to forget him, but to finally let him go. I don't know where he is now. I don't know if he ever thinks of me, but I do know that wherever he is better without me. And that, I suppose, is the greatest proof that I ever truly loved him. Because if I could undo it all, if I could trade everything I had lost just to see him happy again, I wouldn't even hesitate. And maybe that is my redemption. Not in reclaiming what was lost, but in knowing that some loves are meant to exist only in memories. Some mistakes are meant to haunt you forever, and some goodbyes are meant to last a lifetime.